Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and I'm almost through a book called The Last Gentleman Adventurer, Coming of Age in the Arctic, and it's the experience of Edward Beauclerk Maurice when he was retained as a 16-year-old for the Hudson's Bay Company posts in what is now Nunavut. And why I wanted to review this book was because it speaks of observations and experiences, but it describes the lifestyle of the Inuit at the time. And this man just passed away recently before the book was published in 2004. Now, what drew me to reading an autobiography, if you will, of an experience in the far north? Well, it had come to my attention as I focused my own interests in this part of the world that I still carried certain assumptions. And for example, people in northern Ontario, northern Manitoba have expressed that, for example, one band, the chief and council, with the exception of the person sharing this, are unable to write their own documents. So do not have a command of the English language, for example, that allows them to do up their own VCRs, band council resolutions, dependent on others. So their own voices are not actually recorded, if you will. And the question whether those who are mostly outsiders then coming in, trying to convey that and draft these things, when they're reading them, are they understanding the distinctions between how they would express themselves and how their decisions are being written down? Because of course those so-called experts that would be involved in that, primarily lawyers for example, tend to use terms that carry domestic Aboriginal law definitions from domestic courts of Canada that can completely change the meaning of what's actually written. And also my own experience, I spent about a year in Yellowknife, and what impressed me was how so many people still spoke their original language and how many languages are recognized in that part of the world and are still used and being preserved as best possible. A lot of discussion about elders, for example, not able to read English. It's not, again, unexpected because being so far north, for example, they're still living much closer to their original life patterns, if you will, in terms of how to survive in northern climates and northern areas. And a lot of decision making is taking place around them. And my concern about how to best communicate and sweep away any assumptions I have about the level of understanding on serious constitutional issues. Canadian Constitution's attempts to undermine Indigenous nationals, undermine treaties, things of that nature. A lot of what I discuss is not really within the experience of a lot of the decision makers in the North. So in reading this book, even though this is dealing with Inuit, as opposed to Dene, for example, it helps me, puts me into that frame of mind. One of my prized gifts I received when I was in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, is a beautiful white fox hat. Beautiful hat. I was really surprised to read in this book this interesting fact, and I don't think I'll look at my white fox hat the same anytime soon. Before the Hudson's Bay come, the Baffin Inuit used the fur of the white fox primarily to wipe their babies' bottoms. They must have thought white man's obsession with this fur a little peculiar, at least until they became obsessed with it themselves. For a white fox pelt was virtually the only item they could trade for rifles, bolts of cloth, tools, sugar, and tea. In a decent fox year, an Inuit trapper would have enough trade goods to fill his tent. In a bad fox year, he would owe his soul to the company's store. Either way, that trapper would be at odds with his own past. In the words of the anthropologist Janice, quote, "The commercial world of the white man caught the Inuit in its mesh. destroyed their self-sufficiency and independence, and made them economically its slaves, end of quote. And this is the intro, a foreword to the book itself that I'm quoting from. And it reviews how the Hudson's Bay Company selected its employees. He said his Hudson's Bay Company recruiter, George Binney, thought the 17-year-old boy's dark looks suggested Eastern blood. And in his not necessarily unbiased opinion, recruits with even a smattering of Asian, Semitic, or Indian blood, Binney was at least egalitarian in his prejudices, did not have the right stuff to be fur traders in the Canadian North. For the Hudson's Bay Company, to use its, in HBC, to use its popular abbreviation, traditionally looked to the Highlands and Islands of Scotland for recruits. The company's thinking went something like this. A Scotsman, preferably a poor one, would be thrifty. He would be accustomed to uncomplaining servitude. He would be used to a rotten climate. And as a Celt, he would be not unlike the primitive people with whom he'd be trading. But Binney felt the company needed educated recruits, what today might be called managerial types, if it was to keep pace with modern times. So he turned his attention to England and to public schools like the one in Sussex that Maurice was attending. And in the foreword, which is actually written by Lawrence Millman from Cambridge, Massachusetts, he says that if Maurice were to visit the area today, he might see a cruise ship anchored offshore and its passengers eagerly looking to buy something, a soapstone carving or maybe fox-skin booties for their mantelpieces. At Ward Inlet, he would find a few scattered boards, all that remains of the old Hudson's Bay Company post. In Iqaluit, the capital of the new Inuit territory of Nunavut, he might see one or two descendants of his Frobisher Bay friends shivering on the streets, members of the town's burgeoning homeless population. The irony of a formerly nomadic people becoming once again, after a fashion, nomadic would not escape him. Nor would the fact that Iqaluit, despite its relatively small size, population at this time 6,500, suffers from a number of modern urban maladies: drugs, muggings, auto thefts, gang fights. Picking up the local newspaper, he might read about an 18-year-old arrested for dealing heroin, and with a start realize that the boy was the grandson of a hunter he knew in another lifetime. Despite having done a final land claim settlement agreement that created the territory of Nunavut, the problems have gotten worse, not better. It concerns me that, especially in the north, we've got climate change, we've got increasing interest in the mineral resources and reserves that exist that have not been tapped, that are anxiously looked at. Many people in the north are still in a significantly large percentage of the population, but that's going to change. More and more non-locals will be coming in and not be Indigenous nationals. And with the government of the Northwest Territories having received devolution in 2014 to now control and manage and issue permits regarding minerals and mining and other economic developments on lands, this is going to be picking up speed. So it concerns me that when the Inuit did their land claim and are now stuck with their situation and not receiving clearly sufficient funding to meet the needs that now exist, these modern problems, if you will, that having gone so very quickly from a traditional lifestyle to a new Canadian lifestyle, if you will, they're still being left behind. How's that going to work for the Northwest Territories remains to be seen. I suspect that the belief of being part of and under the government of the Northwest Territories, they'll feel they can still control because they still have the numbers. But those numbers will change, and it will be interesting to know just how fully decision making is going to happen, because I when I read and hear what the elders say, they're still very close to the land. They're still speaking about their own laws. They're speaking about their lands. Yet they're in processes which say something very different. Do they, and how will they know what's being negotiated is actually what they have instructed be negotiated? It's very, very different. Those who are at negotiating tables may well feel that they're acting in their best interests, but it's important to understand that obtaining fully informed and freely provided consent goes deep. And when I hear from people in areas where land claims have been settled, and they, for instance, Yukon, I was just contacted from a community there, and of course they have a final land claim in place. And when I hear from them their confusion as to why a recent case that came out finds that the charter under the Constitution Act 1982 applies to their governance, clearly they're not aware that when they signed off, they came under Canada and became new entities created by Canadian laws. They really don't understand that, and they think there's something wrong with how the courts are intruding. But it's wrong to intrude when it's a continuing Indigenous nation. It's something entirely different and very lawful for the courts to be called in to deal with matters of a Canadian government. And that's all I have to say.